Hey everyone, welcome back to Barter Hordes. My name is Robert, and for those of you who know this channel as primarily a books related channel, today's video may be one that you just skip right on by because it's not about books at all. I'm talking about my love of NCAA football, college football. And there have been some things on my mind for a couple of years that if someone were to wave a magic wand and put me in charge of the NCAA, that I would change about college football. Now granted, the NCAA has a world of problems, and I'm not going to address any of those in this video. This is just simply one fan's wish list of things that could change about NCAA football to make it more interesting for the actual fans who watch the games. All right, first of all, college football is my favorite collegiate sport. I never played football as a youth. I played Little League Baseball. I played basketball very briefly in high school, and I played 2 years of college lacrosse. So I never played football, but I've always enjoyed it. And probably some of that goes back to my days at Texas Tech when I was in the going band from Raiderland. And it's a great experience to be on the field and to be in the stands at a college football game. I loved it. I do like college basketball, but I tend not to pay a lot of attention to it during the regular season. But come March Madness time, I catch the fever like everybody else does. But college football is still my favorite collegiate sport. But there's some things that drive me crazy about college football and have done so for decades. Really, it comes down to two different areas that I think college football gets wrong. The first thing is football is an objective sport. We keep score. Different plays have different point values. And at the end of the game, we have a winner and a loser. Or in the old days when I was growing up, we actually could have a tie. There is no room in an objective sport like football or basketball for people to vote on who the best teams are and have that count towards the national championship determination. That is absurd. And it's been absurd for decades. Every year since I started watching college football, which is probably 50 years ago, I probably started when I was 10 or 11. I will be turning 60 in the spring. So for 50 years, there has been controversy every year about the voting for who is the best team in the country. It's a dumb thing to do when you have a sport that can determine a winner on the field. So that's the first thing. We need to get rid of voting for whoever's either involved in the college football playoff or who the national champion is. It's just dumb. To prove how ridiculous it is, let's look at this year very quickly. Last week, at the end of the regular season, the team ranked number 5 and one slot outside the college football playoff was the University of Utah. They were 11-1. They hadn't played a team of any merit all year long, but because they were 11-1, the committee had them ranked 5th. They get into the conference championship against Oregon, another team in the Pac-12 that has played a little bit better competition, and Oregon schooled them. It embarrassed them so much the committee dropped them all the way down to, I think, 11th or 12th after that one game, which proves that the committee's just guessing too. The committee doesn't know anything. It's all guesswork, and that should not exist in a sport where you can determine a champion on the field. So, voting for rankings is ridiculous and absurd. It is therefore abolished in the future. The second thing that I would abolish about college football, and this is the real controversial one, is I would do away with the conference system that we have right now because it does not allow for teams to play against a good schedule of competition. And let's look at some numbers to prove my point. At the end of the regular season, the top 4 ranked teams were Ohio State, LSU, Clemson, and Georgia. Each of them had played 12 regular season games. 3 of those teams were undefeated. One of those teams had a single loss. Okay, let's look at Ohio State's schedule. I have to take off my glasses because I'm getting old eyes. Of the 12 games, 6 of Ohio State's games were against teams ranked below number 50 in the FBS. The FBS is the top division of college football. There are 130 teams. Its average ranked team of their 12 regular season games was 57th. What kind of a test is that for the so-called best team in the country? You're playing against teams ranked in the 50s every week? That's not much of a competition. It's not much of a test. And it explains why it's really easy for a team like Ohio State to rack up wins every year. They play against cupcakes. Don't think it's just Ohio State. LSU played 7 teams ranked below 50 in the end of the season rankings. And in fact, one of the teams LSU played in the regular season wasn't even an FBS team. It was from outside the top 130. So they had 7 of those. Their average opponent over the 12 weeks was ranked 60th. Clemson. Clemson is the real puzzler here, and it's not really Clemson's fault, but of 12 regular season games, Clemson played 9 games against teams outside the top 50. 9 of the 12 were against weak competition. And none of the 12 games was against a team ranked in the top 30. Not a single game against a team ranked in the top 30. So Clemson went undefeated. Their average competition was ranked 73rd over the course of the 12 games. And then Georgia's record is very similar to LSU's in that it had 6 teams ranked outside the top 50. Its average opponent was ranked 61st. So the conference schedule doesn't lend itself to the best teams playing any of the other best teams, except very rarely. People talk about LSU's resume, and LSU has some wins against some big teams, but most of their games against stepsisters of the poor. That's not competition. And I'm not picking on LSU. All the teams do this. Penn State did the same thing. My beloved Nittany Lions did the same thing. Every year, their 3 non-conference games are against teams that they know they're going to beat and beat handily. It's just guaranteed padding to their records. I think that's abysmal. And if we're trying to figure out who the best teams in the country are, they need to play each other. Not just 2 games at the end of the long season, but all season long, so we know who the actual best team in the country is. Now, a lot of people will say you can't get rid of the conference system as it exists now because of tradition. These conferences are traditional. There's nothing traditional about the makeup of these conferences the way they are now. When I was in college, granted, that was back in the dinosaur age, Texas Tech was part of what was called the Southwest Conference. That conference doesn't even exist anymore. It used to be a lot of the other schools in Oklahoma and so on were in the Big 8 Conference. That conference doesn't exist anymore. In fact, when the Big 8 and the Southwest Conference disbanded and joined together, they formed the Big 12. Now the Big 12 only has 10 teams. In fact, the Big 12 is probably the one major conference that with just 10 teams can actually play a real conference schedule because they can play all 9 of the other opponents during the course of the year. And they do. But then they throw a conference championship game on top of it, which is completely unnecessary because they've already played everybody in their conference. The Big Ten, which is what Penn State is part of. I was at Penn State when they joined the Big Ten. I was there for graduate school. Before that, they were an independent. Well, the Big Ten now has 14 schools. So don't tell me these conferences are hugely traditional. They change allegiances very quickly and realignment very quickly, and it's all financial. And I'm not here to address financial issues in the NCAA because I don't know enough about them and the issues are very thorny and complicated. But these conferences are not hugely traditional. So that argument really is just grasping at straws. What I would do if you waved the wand and put me in charge of NCAA football, and I'm telling you right up front, this will never happen. There are too many forces that would absolutely hate this idea that it could never possibly see the light of day. So before you lose your shit in the comments, realize that this is just my hypothetical fairyland wish list for what the NCAA could be like. And speaking of that, if you get ugly in the comments, I won't respond, I will block you, and I will erase your comment. We all know sports fans are among the worst on social media for being antisocial. Don't go there. This is just my fun wish list. What I would do is take the 130 teams in the FBS and I would break them up into 10 divisions, 13 teams in each division. Now, how you break them up is going to be somewhat controversial the first year. There are lots of different ratings out there. CBS Sports rates the top 130 in order. ESPN has its Football Power Index, and I use both of those sets of rankings. For the statistics I read you before on the average opponent strength, that came from CBS's rankings at the end of the regular season. For this next part, I've been using ESPN's Football Power Index because it's just as convenient, and I think it actually shows a little bit more realistic view of the teams at the end of the season this year. So let's say that you're going to break them up using some ranking systems. I don't care what ranking system you actually use, because after you do it the first time, the rankings go away forevermore and don't make any difference. But let's say we use the Football Power Index and split the teams into 10 divisions based on their Football Power Index at the end of this season. Your 13 top teams that would then become the top league, League One in NCAA football next year, would be Ohio State, Clemson, LSU, Alabama, Georgia, Auburn, Oregon, Florida, Oklahoma, Wisconsin, Penn State, Michigan, and Notre Dame. Now just imagine as a fan getting to see those 13 teams playing each other all season long. You'd have to have a season that was probably say 14 weeks long, so they could start the Saturday after Labor Day and they'd be done mid-December. Every team would have one bye week because it would be the odd team out. And then halfway through the season, say after week 6 or something, you could have a week off for everybody to kind of rest and recover a little bit. So a 14-week season. Each team would play the other 12 teams in their division, 6 home games, 6 away games. And at the end of the season, you have a national champion from League One based on the team with the best record in that division because they played everybody. It's determined on the field. Now, a lot of people would say, there's too much money in college sports. They would never allow something like that. But can you imagine the TV revenues for those 6 games every weekend? People get to see the best 13 teams knocking against each other every single week. I think they would be phenomenal and would more than make up for any changes. In fact, I think the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th division would probably also get very good TV contracts, not as lucrative as the top division. Now, before you lose your mind and say, well, that's unfair. What about the teams that are not in the top division? They can never compete for the national champion? No, that's not true. I would add one more element from my favorite sport, which is professional football around the world, or what we call here in the United States, soccer. In all of the major soccer leagues around the world, not including the MLS, because the MLS has not figured out that this is essential in soccer, they have a feature called promotion and relegation. Some of you are very familiar with it. Some of you probably never heard of it before. But at the end of the season, let's say that Oregon and Penn State have the worst records in this top division at the end of the season. Those 2 teams would drop down a league for the following year. They would get relegated. Replacing them would be the 2 best teams in the league immediately below them. They would be promoted. So teams play themselves to the level where they deserve to be over time. So nothing is guaranteed. Your spot's not set in stone. If you play terribly a season, you'll drop down a league. If you play really well, you keep getting promoted and you win your league's championship every year, which is kind of like winning a conference championship in some ways. The best thing about this is that it makes every single game hugely meaningful. Even for teams in the middle of the pack or at the bottom of the standings, each week's game becomes hugely meaningful because they're fighting for their position within their league. If they suddenly give up and get creamed the last 3 or 4 weeks, they're going to get relegated down a league. If they fight and they end up in the middle of the pack, they're going to be able to keep their spot in that league for the next year. And from a financial point of view, being in a higher league is more beneficial because TV rights and so on. So I would take the NCAA football structure and develop more of a European football structure where you split them up into different divisions, a pyramid, 10 divisions, and teams can play themselves up and down among those divisions based on how well they do on the field. No one votes on who the best team is in Division 7. The 2 teams in Division 7 with the best records move up to Division 6. And the 2 teams in Division 6 that were the worst that year moved down to Division 7 the next year. It would make so much more exciting football. I remember my very first game at Penn State when I went there for graduate school. I went to several of the games that first year. The first one was against University of Cincinnati. The score was 81-0. No one learns anything from that. And it wasn't that Penn State was running up the score. As the Cincinnati head coach mentioned after the game, after the first quarter, Penn State had all of its starters on the sidelines, was playing with backups, and ran the ball up the middle on every single play. Cincinnati just couldn't stop them. That doesn't teach anybody anything. And when half of your schedule is against weak competition like that, it's boring for the fans. I'm sorry, blowouts are boring. So what would be exciting is watching the best teams actually play each other throughout the regular season and not just in a 2 playoff game series at the end of the year when half the teams in the top 10 are irritated that they're not getting a chance to make that playoff system. Now, some people have argued that you should just expand the college playoff to 8 teams or 16 teams. And I agree with that if you're going to use the playoff system like they do in basketball. But it's hard with football because the season would extend even longer and it's such a physical game that now you're talking about 14, 15 games for these teams in the playoff. You want to add 2 more to that, 16, 17 games in a season. These are young people still, and I'm not sure physically that is really the right thing to do to them. So instead of doing that, finish it up with just the 12-game schedule. The champion is the team with the best record on the field. Now, another argument against this is that, well, you do away with those traditional rivalry games. In soccer, those traditional rivalries don't disappear in years when the teams are in 2 different divisions. My favorite team, as is no secret, is Newcastle United. Their big rival is Sunderland. They're not in the same league this year. They haven't been in the same league for many of the past few years. That rivalry is no less intense when they do finally match up against each other. So I don't think that's really true. Army and Navy are always going to have a rivalry. Michigan and Ohio State are always going to have a rivalry. Penn State and Pitt have always had a rivalry, even though they don't often play each other anymore. But when they do, it's still a rivalry game. If you really wanted to keep those rivalry games going every single year, you could add a 13th game to this schedule as an exhibition game, either the first weekend in September or the third weekend in December, and have it be like a bowl game, like it be an exhibition game. We all know that the bowl games have lost a lot of their luster, so much so that some of the very best players will choose not to play in the bowl games rather than risk an injury that might hurt their chances of going pro. When you have a game that's that meaningless that your best players are willing to sit out, it maybe isn't a sign of a healthy sport. So I would do away with the bowl system. I know, sacrilege. But I would be a lot more excited for 14 weeks during the regular season watching the best teams play each other. Okay, I've rambled on long enough. If you have something you want to discuss or to debate on this topic, please do put your comment in the comments. But I'm warning you right now, I'm not going to get sucked into social media nastiness. Nasty comments, insulting comments, offensive comments will just be deleted without any response from me, and I'll block you from my channel. Every time I talk about sports on this channel, the trolls come out, and I'm not there for that. So you're welcome to think I'm completely clueless about this. A lot of people have told me that already. It doesn't change my wish list. But you're not welcome to attack me personally, and you're not welcome to attack anybody else in the comments personally. Please be nice about it. Let's debate. Let's have fun. I'll be watching the college football playoff, still thinking that it's a bad system, but I still like college football. All right, everybody, for those of you, if you stuck with me to the end and you're among my bookish people, I will see you again on Friday. If you're just here because of the football video, have a great season, and I'll talk to you maybe in the fall. Bye, everybody.